May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Today we continue our series on making change when change is hard. Last week I shared with you how I started to read this book, Switch, recommended by my sister. In it, the authors understand change as an analogy between a rider and an elephant. Making change in our lives is like a rider on top of that elephant. Our rider, that analytical, forward-thinking part of ourselves, likes to plan ahead and follow through on those New Year's resolutions that we make. But there is another part to us, the elephant, the emotional part of ourselves, that loves ice cream, loves to sleep in, and loves routine that you just don't ever have to think about. When the rider on top and the elephant disagree about which way to go, the rider may control the elephant for a little while, but eventually the elephant wins out. That's what makes change so hard. Let me give you an example of how this plays out in our lives. There was this experiment conducted at a university where college students participated in a study of food perception. They went to a lab after being told not to eat for 3 hours, then were led into a room that smelled amazing. It was filled with the aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. There were 2 bowls in the room. One had these delicious chocolate chip cookies in it, while the other had radishes. They were told they were being tested on their memory associated with the sensations of eating. As students were led into the room one at a time, some were told to eat the cookies, while others had to eat just the radishes. Amazingly, despite being in the room with no supervision, everyone tasted and ate only what they were asked to eat, either the cookies or the radishes. That's the willpower of the rider at work. But after the test, after it was over, they were asked about a second, supposedly unrelated study. The researchers wanted to know who was better at solving problems, college students or high school students. Here the students were given a series of complicated puzzles that were literally impossible to solve. The researchers wanted to see how long the college students would keep working on the puzzles. The untempted students who had not had to resist eating the chocolate chip cookies, well, they spent 19 minutes on the second test. Those that were tempted, though, who could only eat the radishes, they spent 8 minutes on the task. Why did the people who ate radishes quit so early? The answer is simple. They ran out of self-control. Self-control is an inexhaustible resource. It's like working out at a gym where the first bench press is easy, but the next 100, well, that last one is nearly impossible. There was a similar study done backing this up. Some people were asked to restrain their emotions while watching a sad movie about sick animals. Afterward, they showed less physical endurance than those who had let the tears flow freely. Change for people is hard, especially when it's sapping our self-control. So what do? How do we make change that lasts? How do we help the rider on the elephant to get us to our destination, whether it's losing weight or to quit smoking or living a life more fully dedicated to Jesus Christ? Our rider needs help to keep control of that elephant. So here we come to our first of 3 steps. Step 1, direct the rider. I remember a time in my life where I felt a pretty desperate need for some change. I come from a family that just loves to argue. Growing up, many meals around the dinner table ended with everyone disagreeing about what a word means and my mom going to get the dictionary to look it up and solve the issue. Strangely, the dictionary never settled any arguments in our family.
There was one particular disagreement that sticks out in my memory. I must have been maybe 14 at the time, and someone had asked, wait, is Russia in Europe or in Asia? I, being a big fan of both geography and Russian novels, chimed in, Russia is both in Europe and in Asia. It's divided by the Ural Mountains. Well, that didn't make any sense to my family, and my older brothers and my parents were equally divided on whether their little one had figured out whether Russia was actually in one of these two continents. Now, the problem is not that my family isn't very keen on geography. The problem is that everything turned into an argument. My family needed to change. We needed to break out of that nasty habit of turning every conversation into an occasion for arguing. We weren't going to change without some help directing the rider. So here's what the brothers Dan and Chip Heath suggest. They call it finding the bright spots, and we heard about it with our young ones. In my family's situation, that would mean taking a look at times where my family doesn't argue. Are there ever meals that don't end in fighting? If so, we should take a look at those situations and see what's different about them. If we can do it sometimes, then maybe we can replicate that in other situations. All it takes is one bright spot to potentially find a way forward and help out our rider on top of that elephant. Here's a story of someone who found a bright spot that made a huge difference for children. Jerry Sternin worked for Save the Children back in 1990 and was asked to open a new office in Vietnam to fight malnutrition there. The foreign minister of Vietnam, though, told Sternin that people there didn't really appreciate his presence and that he had 6 months to make a difference or he would be kicked out of the country. Well, Sternin had no staff and few resources in a country where he didn't even know their language. The country had poor sanitation, nearly universal poverty, and almost no clean water. It seemed like he was walking into an impossible situation. Sternin, though, decided he would search for bright spots, successful efforts worth emulating. He went to the villages and asked the mothers there to weigh each of the children. From that, they found that despite the terrible situation families found themselves in, some children were still able to maintain proper weight gain. They were properly nourished despite all their difficulties. So Sternin then figured out what most people were doing. Kids ate twice a day. They consumed soft, pure foods like rice. The bright spot kids, as it turns out, were doing things differently. They were eating several times a day, at least 3 or 4 meals. Parents were actively encouraging them to eat even when they were sick, and their food was also very different. Instead of just rice from the communal bowl, they were also eating shrimp and crab, which was considered adult food. Plus, they had sweet potato greens that were thrown in with it, despite the fact that these were known as poor people food. In the end, Sternin was able to have local moms lead cooking lessons for the others. They showed them how these simple steps led to healthy, strong children, helping to reach 2.2 million Vietnamese people and lead the nation out of malnourishment. Some of you may be wondering how these stories relate to your faith. How does finding the bright spot and making changes in your life connect with Christianity? I think finding the bright spot is exactly what Paul did when he wrote to his sisters and brothers in Thessalonica. You heard me read it earlier. Paul is sharing with the people about how faithful the people have been. They are growing in faith. They are showing love and care for each other. Paul even says he and his friends are bragging to other people about how great this little church is. The people have not had a very easy time. When Paul, the apostle, was there, they had been accused of promoting a king besides Caesar. and it caused a lot of controversy there. So Paul leaves, and this little church continues to meet and care for each other, but they're being persecuted for their faith. The book of Acts describes some of these things. Christians being picked out of a crowd, dragged in front of everyone, beaten, sometimes even killed for their faith. They didn't do anything wrong. They were just randomly selected from among the Christians. So Paul is impressed with this group. They have faith. They are following through on what it really means to be a Christian. But hold on a second. There's more to this story than just the good stuff. When you read through these 2 letters to this group, you pick up hints of all kinds of bad things happening. People have taken Paul's teaching and they've perverted it. Some are saying there's a future hope that has nothing to do with Jesus or how you live your life. Some are too lazy to work for food and just talk all day doing nothing. For a small little church, they have lots of problems. They are in desperate need of change, and Paul helps them on their way by finding the bright spots. He highlights how they work through their suffering and love each other in a way that makes Paul proud. Paul, too, is not the only one in the Bible that works to find the bright spots in people. Ruth decides to follow her mother-in-law despite the fact that she has no money and supposedly no future. The prophet Daniel interprets dreams about prosperity for his king despite his oppressive regime. And Jesus, over and over, when confronted by the poor, the dirty, the marginalized, says, "Come to me." He says, "You are forgiven and you are God's beloved." This is part of our faith. When we want to see things happen differently in our life, we've got to find those bright spots. We've got to see the good that is already happening around us so we can imitate it, duplicate it, and make it a regular part of how we live. Let me just say one thing to make sure I'm clearly understood. I am not saying we just believe or act like everything is good when it's not. This is not a power of positive thinking kind of gospel. This is about identifying the good that is already happening in whatever area in which you'd like to see change. Working hard to make sure more of it happens around you. And living into a kind of consistency that makes life different for you. We look at where things are happening right in life, so we have those motivated riders, so we can make change and make it permanent in our lives.